Sit up straight, get a job, get married, get a career, and always remember to die. There is a gulf between what one generation considers being a grown-up and what another generation considers being a grown-up. The older generation will always try to instill, forcibly if necessary, the values of what it perceives as responsibility to the younger generation, in spite of the fact that the younger generation will face different challenges and will consider new values.
And I'm the only one taking any responsibility for it.
That's your version of my life, not mine.
What we must be when we grow up may not be so narrow as to include a specific career and a specific spouse, but the expectations of the older generation will still have limitations on what the career should be and the kind of spouse that is allowed, as well as the behavior and even politics of the new grown-ups. Generations Y and Z, due in part to recent technological and economic shifts, have needs and desires so alien to the generations that came before them that they are, at times, shocking to those in the older generations. The influx of millennials are killing articles being the most prevalent example of this horror and alarm from the old guard. Generation Y was recently rechristened the Millennial Generation. The exact dating of Generation Y and of Generation Z vary from researcher to researcher, but a good rule of thumb is that Generation Y was born in the 1980s through most of the 1990s, whereas Generation Z was born immediately thereafter. I was born in 1982. I'm Generation Y, a millennial, a term I simply have to adopt. Generation Y and the now coming-of-age Generation Z are living in apartments with roommates rather than buying houses. They are also not having children of their own at the rate that previous generations did. They are also riding bikes more often. All these things make the older generations think of kids. Dorm rooms, a child-free lack of responsibility, and bicycles. The older generations wonder, are the two most recent generations just a bunch of overgrown kids? Well, no. We live in apartments because we can't afford houses. We don't have children because we can't afford to. We ride bicycles because we can't afford cars. We went to college, and college tuition is many times greater than in previous generations, and that debt has crippled us. We are also living in a world that is still recovering from the worst recession in about 80 years, the result of the actions of politicians and businessmen who were baby boomers and Generation X. Some millennials had not yet reached puberty in 2008. It wasn't us. Another reason the birth rate is down is because teen pregnancy is down. Generation Y had access to better sex education and contraception, and this is even more true of Generation Z. Sex education in schools, sure, but also sex education through the internet. Contraception obtained in the traditional way, sure, but also easier access to buying it through the internet, as well as education on how to use it successfully from the same source. Information changed who we are. Generation Y were the first generation to have the internet before they graduated high school, and Generation Z was born into the world in which the internet was already the standard. It allowed us to form communities online. It also allowed us to adopt more radical political positions due to dissatisfaction with the system that made us this way. Because of all these reasons, Generation Y and some of the now voting age Generation Z are infantilized by the media. Generally media run by older, richer generations who are themselves responsible for the market that created us. This has changed the perception of what it means to grow up, to become adults, to be strapped in and forced into adulthood. I am admittedly painting with the same broad brush that the media uses here, so don't get indignant if this does not apply to you, but to previous generations, growing up meant becoming colder. Not only serious, but stern, shunning fun, mocking imagination, hopefulness.
He's hopeless.
I'm not hopeless. I'm hopeful.
Meeting societal expectations of owning a home, raising 2 to 3 children. The features of life that the older generations have decreed are essential. Having a job you hate because suffering builds character. The problem with that line of thinking is that the suffering never ends, at least not until retirement, long enough that the light in your eyes has gone out. Millennials and even those younger don't even have that to look forward to based on our debt and our declining funds for retirement. Under the rules of the older generations, our suffering, our character building must never end. We have been instructed to follow the rules of the previous generation rather than to create our own, and when we attempt to do so, we are mocked for not being realistic, which actually only means not behaving like previous generations. In reality, the younger generations have a very realistic view of their lives because we are living under more economically challenging conditions that make it impossible not to notice the struggle. The older generations created the rules by which we are governed, and if the younger generations opt out of these rules, what is deemed essential, then it is seen as forfeit rather than what it really is: the desire to create new rules, new ideas about what it is to be a grown-up. Generations Y and Z have rebelled against this paradigm.
I quit.
The term grown-up for us does not mean what it once did. For Generation X and the baby boomers, being a grown-up meant putting away childish things, but these childish things were not only our toys, but whatever they considered antithetical to the status quo. Things Generations Y and Z have adopted: radical politics, anti-capitalism, and skepticism of present authority, particularly the police. If a millennial achieves power within the older generation's power structure in such a way that it furthers the interests of the older generation, such as a young capitalist, then that millennial is seen as useful. But when a millennial achieves even a small amount of power within the older generation's power structure and does not approve of said structure, they are attacked, mocked, made to be seen as unrealistic, even though, as I said, their view of the world is more grounded in harsh reality than is given credit. Due to the accessibility of information, we now know the figures who keep us down: the businessman, the conceited man, the snake. They decide what is essential. They count the stars so they can own them. Hi everyone, thanks for watching this week's episode. If you'd like to contribute to the show, please click on the Patreon link, and if you just want to subscribe, go ahead and do that, but remember to click that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.